In this video lesson, we're going to be looking at banding. Banding is an effect that happens when there are visible lines along a gradient, and they usually occur when smooth backgrounds such as skies or studio backgrounds have additional gradients added to them digitally. When the values within a gradient get pushed to the point that there isn't enough information in the actual file to account for the changes that you have applied digitally, this creates banding. Banding is not acceptable in professional retouching and immediately makes an image appear to be badly retouched. We generally want to be invisible as retouchers, and so to have our gradients visible with banding breaks that illusion. Here is how to deal with banding. So as you can see here, we've got a plain grey background and we've added two gradients to it. And this has then created this banding effect. The first small tip or trick that you could deal with this is you could go to your actual mask and you could add noise to it. So I'm going to go to Filter, Add Noise, and I'm going to make it Gaussian, and I think 8 is fine. Then if I do the same filter and just repeat that last filter, you can see the banding is now gone. The downside to this is that usually the amount of grain you need to add to get rid of the gradient makes grain visible on your background. So let's talk about how else you can deal with it. And before we do so, we need to discuss bit depth. Bit depth is the amount of color information an image can store. The higher your bit depth, the more color information your image has, but also the larger your file size. The lower your bit depth, the more prone to banding your image is. As a happy medium, most retouchers have settled on working in 8-bit to balance the color information they need against the file size they work with. To avoid banding, you want to process your file with as much information as possible. In other words, you want to process a raw file to an uncompressed format like a TIFF or PSD without adding a ton of contrast or color when processing, but rather simply just adjusting the exposure and white balance and addressing the rest of your grade in Photoshop. This is because in Photoshop you can convert a file to a higher bit depth, like 16-bit, but this will only affect the adjustment layers you have and not the original information you're working with. So the more color information you have in your original file, and the more work you leave to doing in Photoshop, the more latitude you will have overall. So retouchers have a trick. They work in 8-bit, starting with a relatively flat file, especially where they expect to encounter banding, which is most common on plain backgrounds, and occurs most frequently when adding vignettes and gradients. They then do all their grading and color work in Photoshop, adding vignettes and gradients as adjustment layers. If banding occurs, they then, when they have finished their retouch, convert the file to 16-bit. At the very top of their layer stack, above all their adjustment layers, they then create a copy merge layer whilst in 16-bit. This merges all the information into a pixel layer, but uses the 16-bit depth information to do so. This results in a smoothing out of the banding caused by their below adjustment layers, and they can then convert the PSD back to 8-bit. They now have a decently sized file with all the benefits of 16-bit, but hopefully no more banding. And I'll show you how this works now. So I'm just going to take off this liquify layer, and I've gone into my local color corrections and I've added some gradients to the background. Now this is just for demonstration purposes. I don't necessarily think this suits the image. Now what I need to do is to go to Image, Mode, and 16-bit. I'm just going to OK that. Now I've got a file in 16-bit mode, and you can see at the top here it says 16. I'm just going to Command Shift Alt and E, creating a copy merge layer on top. And as you can see, when I flick through, that banding, if I just zoom in here, that banding appears less visible. And if you can't see the difference, that might just be due to the video compression. But hopefully you will be seeing a visible difference there. So now all I need to do is go to Image, Mode, and back to 8-bit, and I get my file size back down. I can then name this layer 16, and if I wanted to, I could actually make this the smart object and just make this the liquify as well, the liquify layer, so that I don't have two layers on top there. And I could delete that and go 16 LQ. And there you go. That's a very simple way to deal with banding that's used in most professional retouching houses.